I tested the buffs and changes to the sentries, orbitals and the eagle in the latest patch to see just how much better they really are. First up we have the rocket sentry, which has an interesting set of changes that are a substantial buff. It has a decreased spread and apparently prioritizes larger targets now, which, well, as you can see, it doesn't. So that's pretty lame. But its range has been increased by 25 meters to 100 meters, which is amazing. They did decrease the rockets per salvo from 2 to 1, citing their reason was to get a better ammo economy when the old sentry would take over a minute of constant firing to get all its rockets out anyway, and no sentry is going to survive that long, so their reasoning for it was a bit odd. Anyway, I digress. Its damage per rocket was buffed by 100 to 300 in total, which means it can kill normal chargers in 3 headshots if it catches them, but with the introduction of the Cometh Behemoth chargers, you rarely see that happen now as they take way more shots to kill. To see if we got a positive change though, I calculated the DPS for the sentry before and after the buff by calculating the RPM for each, which was 36 for the old variant, but what they did not specify in the notes was how much faster it fires the new 1 rocket salvos. It came out at a huge 60 shots per minute for the new one. I multiplied this by the damage and divided it by 60, and the old sentry came out at a DPS of 120, with the buff version coming out at a huge boost with a DPS of 300, which is more than double the damage output. It truly brings a tear to the eye. Actually a big change. It's worth noting though that the new buffed sentry will pause from firing briefly whenever it's targeting a new enemy, but overall this is a massively wonderful change. Next we have the machine gun sentry, which beforehand was worse than the Gatling in every single recordable metric, and for those that say it conserves ammo and can last longer, that is incorrect because the Gatling has a longer firing time despite shooting faster, so yeah, it's just better. But now the machine gun sentry has had its cooldown reduced by an entire minute from 180 seconds to 120, which was a commonly suggested buff in the comments of my sentry video, so it's nice to see it getting this buff, so we can use it more often on the battlefield. With the cooldown upgrade, this makes the in-game cooldown 108 seconds, and means you can have 2 on the battlefield at once, as long as the first one does not expend its ammunition. On top of this lovely buff, every single weapon that uses that same machine gun, which is the machine gun sentry, Gatling sentry, Patriot exosuit as well as the machine gun support weapon, are all enjoying an increase in damage from 80 to 90 per shot, which has increased the machine gun sentry's DPS from 880 to 990 and the Gatling sentry's DPS from 2080 to 2340. I would probably say the Gatling sentry is still way better, to be honest, as it simply deals way more damage and can shoot for longer as well. Over a 20-minute period you can only use the machine gun sentry 4 more times over the Gatling, so while it's a nice buff to get its lower cooldown, it's not quite enough in my opinion. I think it really ought to have had its cooldown taken to at least 90 seconds for it to be substantial, which would be almost half of the Gatling sentries, and considering it does less than half of the damage over its time alive, well, I think that would probably be quite fair. They did buff the sentry's durability as well from an entire 0% to 80. It was 0 before, no wonder they were dying so quickly, but let's dive into it before we make real judgments. Previously, I recorded the sentries as taking 11 shots from the starter pistol. I switched to the Redeemer SMG for the comparison test, as the Peacemaker has since been buffed slightly, but the SMG retained the same damage. They now take 43 shots to kill, which is a huge 4 times boost to their HP or damage resistance. However, they still perish to 1 shot from the autocannon and a single automaton missile, which means the durability is only protecting them from light attacks. And let's be honest, they don't die from light attacks most of the time. This week's hotfix patch did finally make the explosion resistance upgrade worth something though, as they gave the sentries an undisclosed higher destruction value, so most of the explosions do not instantly destroy them regardless of the damage amount, which proves it really has been a useless upgrade for months at this point. But they can now survive the explosion of the autocannon nearby, as well as some other explosions, as long as they aren't a direct impact. It would still be nice for the sentries to have a way to survive direct impacts, as that is what's killing them most of the time, not nearby explosions. But I suppose it's nice to have something buffed and fixed than nothing. I think the sentries still need some looking at because they're just not in a position where many people will be taking them into battle apart from that one defense mission we only get every so often. Their durability needs looking at again, and also can we get them to stop pulling insane levels of aggro? Once you throw down a sentry, it's impossible to persuade a Bile Titan or anything from targeting them, so they just walk over and destroy them. This is so lame. Changing that mechanic alone would improve their life expectancy tenfold. All it would need is if a player was able to shoot the target that was going for the sentry and they'd switch targets to the player. That's as simple as that, and it'd just make it so much better. Moving on to the Orbital Gatling, which has had a host of lovely changes. Its fire rate has been increased by 25%, rounds per salvo from 30 to 60, it's been given heavy armor penetration, and to top it all off, a 10-second base cooldown reduction. These changes work beautifully together. The stratagem lasts 5 seconds longer than before, and you'll have to wait much less time after it's done firing at 63 seconds versus the old 72 seconds of downtime, making that downtime much less painful. The best place I've found this buff to be is on Terminid bug breaches, especially as it will properly hurt chargers now as well. With the heavy armor penetration, just check how much it's peppering all of the enemies. Really beautiful stuff. It's also great for bot dropship call-ins, as all the enemies drop in a static area, so really it's just good for those specific moments where all the enemies are coming down or up in a fixed place. Though on the bug side, with the amount of behemoth charger spawning, it does kind of suck a little bit there. Overall though, an absolutely great chain of buffs for this stratagem for sure. The Orbital Precision Strike comes in with some tame cooldown related buffs, 10 seconds off the base cooldown, making it 81 seconds once upgraded, as well as a call-in time reduction of 50% from 4 seconds to 2 seconds. This is absolutely huge for the general usability of the stratagem, which genuinely makes it feel much more worth choosing as a pick for those larger target kills, such as hulks and Bile Titans, as the shell impacts so much faster now, which means less stress calculating where to deploy the orb. For reference, here is a comparison of what the call-in time difference actually looks like in-game. It really does make a huge difference. The Orbital Airburst strike has also had a cooldown reduction, taking it from 120 seconds to 100 seconds, or 90 with the ship module upgrade. Another decent buff for its general usability, as it will have much more uptime throughout a mission, giving us 3 more uses over a 20-minute period. And finally, to cover the Eagle changes, we come to a meh change with the Eagle rocket pods, which has improved targeting, which is good, increased armor penetration from 5 to 6 I believe, meaning it does 100% of its damage to heavy armor now, rather than 50, which is also good, but for some reason, they've decreased the damage by more than 50%, from 600 to 250, as well as the explosion armor penetration being nerfed so that it can't damage heavy armor, which effectively means the rocket pods are the same but different, but also fractionally worse. They never consistently one-shot anything except tanks and buildings, just like before, so they gave it a wall of changes that really mean nothing. If they reduced the damage to 350 rather than 250, it'd probably be a net buff, because then dealing 50% more damage would actually mean something, but they didn't, so the change that they said wasn't a nerf actually was one by about 50 damage. Bravo. And finally, the Eagle Strafing Run has finally had its uses increased to match the cluster bombs, as that never really made sense before, so 5 uses after upgrading now, and it also has heavy armor penetration. Woohoo! It can damage those heavy units much better now, though it's still a little meh against them. Despite the change, it's probably due to the area that it shoots is just not quite wide enough to really catch a lot of enemies, and they don't usually walk in a big line, except maybe bot patrols, but you're still not going to pick off too many of the enemies with that, and yeah, it's probably not something I'll be taking into combat personally. How do you feel about all the changes made to the sentries, orbitals and eagles? Overall, I think it's really positive, but some are quite odd or need looking at further. But for now, I'll catch you on the next one.